Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad you're here. I'm Dawn Dietrich, the director of Western Reads, and it's my privilege to introduce the author. Every year, there's a story to be told about how the Western Reads book gets chosen. But last year's story began with my colleague, Anna Carey, telling me about the profound impact reading The Boys in the Boat had on her. I couldn't put it down, she said, and I cried at the end. I never cry, if you know Anna. I never cry. I certainly never cry about books, she said. I thought, that is interesting. But Anna does crew. She's a rower. She's a member of the Whatcom Rowing Association. She's probably biased. Well, later that day, we had a Western Reads event that was attended by parents and students at Fall Family Open House. And after my presentation, I'm not kidding, a parent came hurtling down the aisle with a book in his hand. Wait, he said, I know the perfect book for Western Reads next year. It's The Boys in the Boat. And he proceeded to explain what he found excellent about the book and why he thought it would be perfect for our campus community. So nonplussed, I took the book in my hands and began flipping through the pages, thinking, gee, maybe I need to pay attention to this. Later that week, when a student approached me about a recommendation for Western Reads, I said, wait, let me guess. You want to read The Boys in the Boat? The student said, how did you know? So that was my introduction to Daniel James Brown's book. Without further delay, I got my own copy and started reading, and like countless others, I could not put it down once I started. What a read. A compelling and heart-wrenching story of fortitude, a detailed glimpse of Depression-era Seattle, a look at the Berlin Olympics as staged by Hitler, and a darn good story told in our own backyard. I was sold. Of course, so are many other people. As you may have heard last week, Mr. Brown was awarded the 2014 Washington State Book Award for History and General Nonfiction. The film rights to the book have been purchased by the Weinstein brothers, and they're producing a script right now. And The Boys in the Boat has been a bestseller on the New York Times list for months. Pretty convincing signs, I would say, of having made it in the literary world. Thus, it is my deep pleasure to introduce the author to you today. Mr. Daniel James Brown received a Bachelor of Arts degree in English from UC Berkeley and attended graduate school at UCLA. He taught at San Jose University and Stanford University before becoming a technical writer and editor with Microsoft. Mr. Brown is the author of several narrative nonfiction books, including his debut book, Under a Flaming Sky, The Great Hinckley Firestorm of 1894, which traces personal stories and social, economic, and environmental causes of the Great Hinckley Fire of September 1st, 1894, which burned an area of up to 250,000 acres, including the town of Hinckley, Minnesota. The fire killed hundreds of people, including Brown's great-grandfather. Brown's second book, The Indifferent Stars Above, the harrowing saga of a Donner Party bride, traces the footsteps of Sarah Graves, a young bride who left her home in Illinois in the spring of 1846, bound for California. Sarah was one of a handful of the ill-fated Donner Party members who attempted to hike out of the Sierra Nevadas to save herself and her family. Brown states about his writing, my primary interest as a writer is in bringing, compelling historical events to life as vividly and accurately as I can. Currently, he lives in the country outside of Seattle, Washington with his wife, 2 daughters, and an assortment of cats, dogs, chickens, and honeybees. He says when he's not writing, he's likely to be birding, gardening, fly fishing, reading American history, or chasing bears away from the beehives. So somebody can ask him about that during the Q&A. Please join me in welcoming Daniel James Brown to Western Washington University.
Thank you. Thank you. That was a wonderful introduction. I've been having a lot of introductions lately, and that's great. I really enjoyed that. Thank you. You know, I think I'm going to need a little, if it's possible, get a little more light on this podium from the house lights. I don't know if that's possible, but my eyes are pretty bad. If it's not, I'll make do. You can all hear me? Great. Thank you. So this is a story. The Boys in the Boat is a story that culminates, of course, in the 1936 Berlin Olympics. And I think when most of us hear the phrase 1936 Berlin Olympics, the first thing that comes to mind is the Jesse Owens story, and rightly so. The Jesse Owens story is one of those iconic American stories that we keep alive, we tell our children and our grandchildren, we put in our textbooks, because it's a story that helps define who we are as a people. And it's a story, you know, it tells us what we value. It reminds us of what we value, things like fairness and equality and a level playing field and great individual achievements. I think the story of these 9 kids from Western Washington who went to Berlin on the same boat with Jesse Owens that summer, I think it also deserves to be told and retold, because it also helps remind us of who we are as a people. But it does it from a very different vantage point in at least one way. And that is, it's not a story of a great individual achievement. It's a story of a great team achievement. And I think it helps remind us that, at least historically, we are a people who have been pretty good at building great teams and getting great things done. And I'd like to come back to that theme a little bit at the end of the talk, basically. But first, let me talk a little bit about how I came to write the book, because that's so much an essential element of how it came to be, but also the essence of what it really is. We have in my neighborhood, I live in Redmond, or actually in the country east of Redmond, and it's a fairly rural, sort of semi-rural neighborhood. But we have this hideous thing called a homeowners association. And we are required to get together once a month, or once a year, and argue with one another, basically, about whatever we are most worked up about at that point. It's something weighty, like what color you may or may not paint your mailbox, or something like that. And 6 years ago, the meeting was at my house, and after the meeting, a lady I knew only as Judy came up to me, and she introduced herself to me, reminded me who she was, and she said she'd been reading one of my earlier books, Under a Flaming Sky, to her father, and that her father was in the last couple months of his life living under hospice care at her home. And he was really enjoying that book, and she wondered if I would come down to meet him. So I think it was the next day I went down and I met this elderly gentleman named Joe Rance. And Joe was very weak. He was stretched out on a recliner. He was on oxygen, but he was very alert mentally. And so I sat down. We talked a little bit about that earlier book, but quite quickly we shifted over. He started talking about his experiences growing up during the Depression. And if you read the book, you know he had a very difficult family situation to overcome growing up. And then he began to talk about how he had come to row crew at the University of Washington beginning in the fall of 1933, and how he and his crewmates had wound up rowing, amongst others, against a German boat in front of Hitler and Goering and Goebbels and all the top Nazis at the 1936 Olympics. And as Joe was telling me this story, I was just absolutely mesmerized by it. And I noticed from time to time he was struggling to keep back tears. And I noticed that it was whenever he started to talk about any of the other boys in the boat that these tears would come to his eyes and he would choke up. And at first I thought he was crying for the loss of them. Most of them had passed away just in the preceding few years. And I'm sure that was part of it. But as we talked more, I began to see that there was an enormous amount of joy and pride coming through those tears. And as I say, I was mesmerized by the story, and I hadn't gone down there intending to look for a book topic. I'm usually really, really picky about finding book topics. That was the last thing on my mind when I went down there, but I just impulsively, I thought this is just a great story, so I asked Joe, I said, Joe, can I write a book about your life? And that was totally the wrong way to put it, because he immediately shook his head and looked downright cranky and put his head down. And I'll never forget this, because then he thought for a minute, and then he looked up, and there were tears in his eyes, and he said, and he sort of croaked it out, he said, but you could write a book about the boat. And I didn't know what he meant at first. I thought he meant the husky cedar, this beautiful shell, this beautiful cedar shell that he and his mates had rowed in. But we talked a little bit more, and I realized he meant by the boat, he meant the other guys in the boat, of course, plus him, plus the boat. But something even more than that. He really meant this intangible thing, this almost perfect thing that he and those other boys had not just done, but what they had become together that summer in Berlin 75 years before. And when I realized that, it was like a thunderclap for me. I set out on a quest the next day to try to understand what that meant, try to understand what those tears were all about. And that turned into a 4-year odyssey of research and writing and talking to many, many of the families involved and so on and so forth. And eventually it turned into The Boys in the Boat. Now, ever since the book has come out, I get email all the time from people all over the country, actually increasingly from all over the world. And there's certain comments that come up over and over in these emails. And one of the most prominent, this is probably the most prominent, the one that comes up most often, is I get emails every day that in one way or another say something like, I almost didn't read your book because I thought it was about rowing, and really what could be more boring than a book about rowing? And then fortunately they go on to say, wow, it turned out, that it was about so much more than rowing. I have to say, I would have been one of those people 6 years ago. I don't think I would have picked this book up. I didn't have any particular interest in rowing or any knowledge of rowing, and I would have thought it was pretty boring. But I'll come back to the rowing in a minute, but what I discovered in those years when I was researching this story, of course, is that it's not about rowing, or at least it's not just about rowing. It turned out to be this big, epic, sweeping story about the human heart. It was a story about this one boy named Joe who first learned that he couldn't really trust anyone in the world, and then learned that to get what he wanted out of life, he had to learn just the opposite of that. He had to learn how to trust others on a very deep, fundamental level. It was a story about an almost mystical figure, a sage-like British-born boat builder named George Boat Oct, and how he had shaped the lives of these 9 young men. It was a story about a somewhat hard man named Al Ulbrichtson, who had grown obsessed with realizing an Olympic dream. It was a love story. It was a story about grit and determination in the face of overwhelming odds, about punishing pain and psychological devastation, but also ultimate jubilation. It was a story about the American genius for defying long odds. It was about the cold realities of American life during the Great Depression. It was a portrait of Seattle during the Depression. It was about the Dust Bowl. It was about Joseph Goebbels and Hitler and Leni Riefenstahl, about propaganda and deceit, about democratic values come face to face with fascist cynicism. And really on that level, it was pretty starkly a story of good and evil. But most of all, it was a story about 9 very decent, very hardworking young men who came together to forge something much larger than the sum of their parts. Now, that's not to say that rowing isn't central to the story. Rowing is the stage on which a number of interesting human dramas unfold. And I said I wasn't interested in rowing when I started this. I am now, actually. Turns out rowing is not at all boring. In fact, it's pretty fascinating. I just want to tick through a few of the things that I have discovered over the last few years that I think are really interesting about the sport. First of all, there's the extreme physical challenge of this sport. There's very few things human beings do that match rowing, and I'm talking particularly now about rowing on this level, this Olympic rowing 2,000-meter sprints at the Olympics. There's very few things that match that for the sheer output of energy and the extraordinary demands that it puts on the human body. A rowing coach once said that rowing a 2,000-meter Olympic race is the equivalent of playing 2 NBA basketball games back to back and doing it all in about 6 minutes in terms of the physiological toll it takes on the body. There's very few things that match rowing and I'm talking now about rowing in a 4 or an 8 or a double, but rowing with others. There's very few things that match it for the extraordinary level of coordination and synchronization and precision and teamwork that are involved in rowing. Another rowing coach said that putting 8 men or women in a shell and asking them to row an Olympic sprint is like putting those 8 men or women in front of 8 golf balls and giving them golf clubs and asking them to swing and hit those golf balls at precisely the same moment with precisely the same amount of force, and then to do that over and over every 2 or 3 seconds or so. Extraordinary coordination and synchronization. There's the incredible mental toughness required to keep at this sport. This is a sport that promises very little in the way of glory and nothing at all in the way of monetary reward. And yet people that do it, as many of you know, get out there very early in the morning on cold, blustery, windy, sleety, sometimes snowy days on, up here it must be Lake Whatcom or Lake Samish, Lake Washington down in the Seattle area, and keep coming back and doing that day after day after day. It takes a lot of mental fortitude, and I've become a huge admirer as I've gone around the country. I've met so many young men and young women who row, and old men and old women, and everything in between, who do this. And there's a certain kind of centeredness and drive and confidence in themselves that they have that's very, very impressive. There's also a long, colorful history and tradition associated with rowing. The first intercollegiate sport in this country happened in 1852, I think it was, when either Harvard challenged Yale or Yale challenged Harvard to a boat race. That's the first intercollegiate contest, athletic contest in this country. There's the aesthetics of the sport, the beauty of a crew that has found its swing, and especially in these days I'm writing about when they rowed in these exquisite cedar shells that George Pocock was making. And there's actually a lot more drama in a crew race than might be obvious to someone standing on the shore of the Montlake Cut or Lake Whatcom or wherever. Watching a crew race from afar is not always the most compelling, dramatic thing. So much of the drama, though, is what's taking place inside the boat, between the gunnels of that boat. One of the things I really wanted to do in this book was drop you inside that boat so you could experience that drama. And in the 1930s, a great deal of the drama came from the enormous crowds that this sport used to draw. It was an enormously popular spectator sport in the 20s, the 30s, and the 40s especially. 100,000 people would turn out for a regatta, and not just on the Charles in Boston, but on the estuary down in the Bay Area, or on Lake Washington, or in the Midwest at Wisconsin or other such places. Prominent oarsmen would find their images on the covers of the Saturday Evening Post or other national magazines. Races, major races were broadcast sometimes live coast to coast on radio, which was then a new medium, and millions of people would turn in to listen to these races. A coxswain's sore throat could make headlines. At the 1936 Olympics in Berlin, at the rowing regatta grounds, the rowing was the second largest venue in terms of spectators, following only the big Olympic track and field stadium that the Nazis built in Berlin proper. So I have a passage I'd like to read to try to illustrate some of this drama, both inside the boat and in the atmosphere that surrounded these races. But I need to sort of set the scene for you because I'm going to pick this up partway through a race. This is June of 1936, and we are in Poughkeepsie, New York on the Hudson River. This race is a long 4-mile race. It's the de facto national championship. There are roughly 100,000 spectators there. Many of them are on hundreds of boats lining the last mile or so of the race course, everything from rowboats to a Navy destroyer that's there for the race. To nourish their dream of going on to the Olympics later that summer, these boys from Western Washington, not Western Washington University, but Western Washington, the place, these boys need to win this race. And in particular, they need to defeat their arch rivals from Cal Berkeley. Kai Bright, the coach at Cal, has won the 2 previous national championships, but more importantly, from Washington's point of view, Kai Bright has twice taken Cal to the Olympics and twice come home with gold medals. Al Ulbrichtson, the Washington coach, is absolutely obsessed with making sure that he and his boys go to Berlin and bring home gold, and Kai Bright doesn't. So in fact, Ulbrichtson has told his wife Hazel that if he can't go all the way this year, all the way to Berlin, he's going to quit coaching. So everything is on the line for Ulbrichtson with this race. The race goes off at 6 p.m. because of tidal conditions on the river, just as dusk is falling over this scene. Ulbrichtson is watching this race unfold from an observation car on a train that is paralleling the race course, going down the Hudson. He's in this car with a bunch of Washington coaches and a bunch of press men. Ulbrichtson is infamous for his reticence. He's often called the dour Dane, or the man with the stone face. He does not like to show emotion, and he especially doesn't like to betray emotion in front of sports writers and the boys who row for him. He's told Bobby Mock, his coxswain, to race from behind, but under no circumstances to get more than 2 lengths behind. But Bobby Mock, and I should mention that Bobby Mock is not above lying to his crew about where they are in the field if it helps keep his crew motivated. Bobby Mock has been holding them a staggering 4 lengths behind for almost 3 miles. And Al Ulbrichtson is growing absolutely frantic as we pick it up. Let's see. In the boat, Bobby Mock took a look at the 4 lengths between his bow and California's stern and hollered to his crew, "Okay, you lugs, we're 1 length behind." Downriver, the thousands of fans packing the shoreline and yachts and other vessels in Poughkeepsie could not yet see the oncoming shells, but they could hear the coxswains barking like so many seals out in the river's darkness. Slowly the barking grew closer. Then the bows of 3 boats began to materialize out of the gloaming just beyond the railroad bridge. A roar went up as the crowd began to discern the state of play. Navy was neck and neck with Cal, and the 2 of them seemed to be running away with it, although Columbia, astonishingly, appeared to be in 3rd place. Cornell, also astonishingly, was nowhere to be seen, but at least the East had 1 boat in the race, after all, maybe 2. Almost nobody even noticed the Washington shell, apparently limping along out in the middle of the river, so far back one could barely see it in the gathering darkness. As the Washington boat swept under the black skeleton of the railroad bridge at the 3-mile mark, it was still nearly 3 lengths back with a mile to go. The leaders had slowed just a bit, and that had narrowed the gap, but if Mock had raised the rate at all, it was imperceptible. The Washington boys were rowing as if into a kind of trance now, somehow detached from themselves, yet keenly aware of one another's every minute motion. There was little sound out in the middle of the river, except for Mock's chanting, the rattle of oars in the oarlocks, their own deep rhythmic breathing, and their pulses pounding in their ears. There was almost no pain. In the number 5 seat, Stub McMillan realized with astonishment that he was still breathing through his nose after 3 full miles of rowing. On the train, Al Ulbrichtson had all but given up. "They're too far behind," he muttered. "They're overplaying their hand. We'll be lucky to finish 3rd. Ulbrichtsen's face was ashen. It seemed to have turned entirely to stone. He'd even stopped chewing his gum. In the lane nearest to him, California had powered back out in front, rowing beautifully. With a tiring field behind them and less than a mile to go, Cal was in a commanding position to win. Kai Ebright, it seemed, had somehow outwitted him again. But if anybody had outwitted Al Ulbrichtson, it was his own coxswain, the short kid, with his own Phi Beta Kappa key. And now he would show his hand. Suddenly he leaned into Don Hume's face and bellowed, "Give me 10 hard ones for Ulbrichtson." 8 long spruce oars bowed in the water 10 times. Then Mock bellowed again, "Give me 10 more for Pocock." Another 10 enormous strokes. Then another lie. "Here's California. We're on them. 10 more big ones for Mom and Dad." Very slowly, the husky clipper slipped past Columbia and began to creep up on Navy in second. Someone on the train idly remarked, "Well, Washington's picking up." But a minute later, someone else called out much more urgently, "Look at Washington! Look at Washington! Here comes Washington!" On the train and on shore, all eyes shifted from the leaders to 8 white blades barely visible out in the middle of the river. Another deep guttural roar began to rise from the crowd. It seemed impossible for Washington to close the gap. They were half a mile from the finish now, still in third place, still 2 lengths back, but they were moving, and the way they were moving compelled immediate and absolute attention. In the boat, Mock was incandescent. "Okay, now, he barked. Don Hume took the stroke up to 35, then to 36, then to 37. On the starboard side, Joe Rance fell in behind him, just as smooth as silk, and the boat began to swing. The bow began to rise out of the water. Washington slid past the middies as if the Navy boat were pinned to the water. Cal's coxswain, Grover Clark, glanced across the river, and for the first time since he left it behind at the starting line, he saw the Washington boat sweeping up on his stern. Stunned, he bellowed at his crew to pick it up, and Cal's rate climbed quickly to 38. Mock hollered at Hume to take it up another notch, and Washington went to 40. The rhythm of the California boat seemed to waver, then grow erratic. California and Washington careened into the last 500 yards, storming down the corridor of open water between spectators' boats. People in rowboats were standing up now, risking a dunking to see what was happening. Some of the large excursion steamers began to list toward the center of the river as people crowded their rails. The roar of the crowd began to engulf the oarsmen. Boat whistles shrieked. On the float in front of Washington's shell house, Vanda Mae Calamar, the crew's cook, waved a frying pan over her head, whooping and urging the boys on. In Washington's press car, pandemonium broke out. George Farnell of the Seattle Times shoved his press credentials into his mouth and began to devour them. Tom Bowles commenced beating a stranger on the back with his lucky old fedora. Royal Brome was shouting, "Come on, Washington, come on." Only Al Ulbrichtson remained motionless and silent, still riveted to his seat, his eyes cold gray stones locked on the white blades out in the river. Joe Williams of the World Telegram stole a glance at him and thought, "This guy has ice water in his veins." With the finish line looming ahead of him in the gathering dark, Bobby Mock screamed something inarticulate. Johnny White in the number 3 seat suddenly had the sensation that they were flying now, not rowing. Stub McMillan desperately wanted to peek, to glance over toward lane 1, where he knew California would be, but he didn't dare. In number 6, over the crowd noise, Shorty Hunt could hear someone on a radio yelling frantically. He tried to make out the words, but all he could tell was that something terribly exciting was happening. He had no idea how things stood, except that he still hadn't seen the California boat fall into his field of view. He kept his eyes locked on the back of Joe Rance's neck and pulled with his whole heart. Joe had boiled everything down to one action, one continuous movement, one thought, the crew's old mantra running on through his mind, hearing it over and over, not in his own voice, but in George Pocock's crisp Oxford accent, "Mind in boat, mind in boat, mind in boat." Then, in the last 200 yards, thinking itself fell away, and pain suddenly came shrieking back into the boat, descending on all of them at once, searing their legs, their arms, their shoulders, clawing at their backs, tearing at their hearts and lungs as they desperately gulped at the air. And in those last 200 yards, in an extraordinary burst of speed, rowing at 40 strokes per minute, Washington passed California. With each stroke, the boys took their rivals down by the length of another seat. And by the time the 2 boats crossed the line, In the last vestiges of twilight, a glimmer of open water showed between the stern of the Husky Clipper and the bow of the California Clipper. In the press car, the corners of Al Ulbrichtsen's mouth twitched reluctantly into something vaguely resembling a smile. He resumed chewing his gum, slowly and methodically. Standing next to him, George Pocock threw back his head and howled like a banshee. Tom Bowles continued to flog the back of the fellow in front of him with his old fedora. George Farnell removed the well-masticated remains of his press credentials from his mouth. In Seattle, Hazel Ulbrichtsen and her son Al Jr. pounded the glass top of their coffee table until it shattered into dozens of pieces. And in the boat, the boys pumped their fists in the dark night air. For a long while, Ulbrichtsen just sat there, staring into the darkness as fans came rushing through the car, congratulating him and slapping him on the back. When he finally stood up, reporters crowded around him, and he said simply, "Well, they made it close, but they won." And then he elaborated, "I guess that little runt knew what he was doing." Thank you. And yeah, that's really the moment at which I think all these guys know how good they were. Ulbrichtsen knew how good they were. I don't think he ever doubted Bobby Mock again. They went on from there. A few weeks later, they went to Princeton and won the right to go to Berlin as Team USA by beating California again and a number of other crews. And off to Berlin they went. Well, there's an interlude about raising the funds that if you've read the book, you know. But now the story culminates, of course, in this extraordinary gold medal race in Berlin, and we're going to show you some film of that in just a second. But first, let me remind you, or tell you if you haven't read the book, what these guys were up against for that gold medal race that day. First of all, it was a raining on and off, blustery, windy, cold day in Grunau, on the Longer Sea, this body of water south of Berlin. The American boat, the kids from Washington, and the British boat had turned in the two fastest qualifying times, but they were mysteriously assigned lanes 5 and 6 out in the widest part of the course, where they would have to row into the head of this wind. Italy and Germany, the two fascist states, had turned in relatively slow qualifying times. They were assigned lanes 1 and 2, protected virtually the entire length of the race course. The American stroke is the guy that sits right in front of the coxswain and sets the rhythm for the whole boat. Everybody replicates his rhythm, basically. Absolutely critical. If there's one critical person with an oar, it's the stroke. Don Hume, the American stroke, had been sick on and off for weeks with some kind of respiratory infection. And for the few days leading up to the gold medal race, he'd been running a high fever and actually was in bed with this fever. Ulbrichtsen wasn't going to put him in the boat, he was so sick. At the last minute, the other guys went to Ulbrichtsen, and very uncharacteristically, because you didn't challenge Ulbrichtsen lightly, they demanded that Ulbrichtsen put Don Hume in the boat, and he did, but he was a very sick kid when he climbed into that boat. There were about 75,000 fans there. Most of them were German. There were some Brits and Americans and others there. Before the racing got underway, Hitler and Goebbels and Hermann Goering swept into the regatta grounds dressed in dark capes, ascended to the balcony of a stone boathouse. The crowd began to chant Sieg Heil, Sieg Heil, and then it shifted over to Deutschland, Deutschland, Deutschland. And as the boys waited, Germany won the first 5 events that day, won gold medals in the first 5 rowing events that day. So the crowd got more and more frenzied. The chant of Deutschland, Deutschland got louder and louder, leading up to the 8-oared race, which is always the prestige event, the big event of the Olympic rowing, the climax. The boys paddle out to the starting line with the crowd roaring, Deutschland, Deutschland, Deutschland. They line up, they're out in the windiest far side of the course, and the start is called, and they don't hear the start. They don't know the race has started till they see the boats off to one side, lurch forward. They dig hard, they row out into the middle of the longer sea, but 1,000 meters down the course, halfway through the course, they and the Brits are tied for dead last. Waves are breaking over the bow. Bobby Mock is sitting in the coxswain seat watching Germany and Italy streak down lanes 1 and 2 toward what appear to be inevitable first and second place finishes. But that's not how it ends, and we're going to show you how it ends. I should tell you, you don't see the American boat until the very end here, at which point the story is very different, but it's a lot of fun to watch. So if we can run the video, that would be great.
Die Entscheidung im Achter. Schweiz, Ungarn, England, Amerika, Italien und Deutschland. Zum ersten Mal bei den Olympischen Spielen hat sich ein deutscher Achter bis zur Entscheidung durchgekämpft. Italien kommt auf. Deutschland greift an. Deutschland holt auf. Zieht gleich. Die Wikinger gehen in Führung. Endkampf ist entbrannt. Die letzten 100 Meter, das deutsche Boot im Vordergrund. Daneben mit weißem Stirntuch die Italiener. Dahinter die Ungarn, neben diesem England. Auf der Außenbahn aber führt Amerika. Deutschland kommt auf. Meter um Meter. Zu spät, zu spät. Amerika hat gesiegt. Erster Amerika. Zweiter Italien. Dritter Deutschland.
So that's a really cool. So a couple of things about that. That's from Leni Riefenstahl's Olympia, this big documentary / propaganda film that she created for the Nazis. Now, there were not cameras in the boat when they raced, of course. All the pulled back shots there are of the footage of the actual race. But then she prevailed on the Italians, the Germans, and the Americans, at least, to re-row the next day, and she put cameras in the boat, and so you get these close-ups in the faces of the rowers and the coxswains. I think the voice, it was laid in later, too. I don't think Bobby Mock, the coxswain, was saying push-pull. I've never heard of a coxswain saying push-pull, but it's a pretty amazing piece of film, and fun to watch. Now, as I say, I get a lot of emails and certain themes or comments come up over and over, and a couple more. One that I get a lot, and it ties into the introduction a little bit, is I get emails, again, every day from people Interestingly, mostly men, although plenty of women too, who say they just finished the book with tears in their eyes. And the other thing that comes up all the time is I get emails almost every day from people on one side or the other of our political spectrum, sometimes quite far to one side or the other of our political spectrum, who say, if only the other side would read this book, the world would be a much better place. And I just find that fascinating, because I mean, I have my own politics, but I didn't write this book with any kind of political intent at all. But I think it's interesting, and I've been trying to figure out a number of things about why people have such an emotional response to the book, and why it is that that response holds true across such a wide spectrum of our society. And I think part of it just comes down to, I think a lot of people, particularly of a certain age, are just remembering or missing a time when things worked better in this country, when we were better able to get along and build teams to get things done. I think there's a general sense that we've lost a good deal of that. But there's also, I think there's certain qualities in these 9 young men as people that readers, that people admire regardless of where they are coming from in our society. These boys seem to be, widely liked and admired. And so I think it's worth just touching on some of the qualities that these particular 9 young men had. And there are others certainly, but I just want to tick through a few of them. First, I think it's very easy to identify with these boys, partly because of their humble origins. They're really quintessentially American guys in that sense. These were guys that grew up around here, actually. One grew up in Deming, which is just up the Nooksack River. Another grew up partly in Anacortes. They all grew up in Western Washington. For the most part, they grew up in mill towns or on dairy farms, or in Joe's case, in a mining camp. These were guys that grew strong, wielding axes and pitchforks and shovels. To get where they wanted to get, they had to go up against and defeat kids who learned to row in prep school, kids who were the sons of titans of industry and U.S. senators and even presidents of the United States. FDR had 2 boys rowing at this same time. Then they had to go up against and defeat kids from Oxford and Cambridge in the UK, kids who in some cases were literally aristocrats. And then they had to go on and defeat this hand-picked Nazi crew. So they're kind of classic American underdogs in that sense. And I think that's part of their sort of universal appeal. Second, it's hard not to admire their extraordinary perseverance. Both physically and mentally, these were kids who were extraordinarily resilient. The guys who made it into the 9 guys who made it into that boat that went to Berlin were the end product of a long process that whittled hundreds of young men at Washington down to that one number 1 boat. There were lots of other guys who rowed and rowed very well, but the guys that made it into that Olympic boat, they were the ones who inevitably showed up day after day, week after week, all through the long, dark winters out on Lake Washington, and kept at it, kept coming back for more. They were also the ones who put up with Ulbrichtsen's often very stern and difficult method of coaching. Third, they were earnest. They believed in the importance of what they were doing. They had a deep pride in representing their country, of course, by going to Berlin as Team USA. But there was something else going on here, and that really has to do with George Pocock. And just very briefly, in case you haven't read the book, George Pocock was this British-born boat builder. He grew up in the boat building shop at Eton College, apprenticed to his father as a boat builder. He came to, first to Vancouver, British Columbia, then came down to Seattle and began to build these beautiful cedar shells that first Washington, and then by the mid-1930s, every rowing program in America wanted one of these Pocock shells. They were beautiful and they were state of the art at the time. But the thing about Pocock is he was a consummate craftsman. He approached building shells. He said of building shells, every time I build a shell, I want it to be better than the one before. And every time I build a shell, I want to leave a piece of my heart in that shell. And he was also a very good oarsman, and he taught these boys, these Washington rowers, to approach rowing as if it were a craft. He taught them that it would elevate them. He taught them they should leave a part of their heart in every race they rowed, that they should try to row as near to perfectly as they could, not just to win, but because the effort of it, the craftsmanship of it, would elevate them and make them part of something larger than themselves. For Pocock, there was even a spiritual dimension to rowing. And the book every chapter in the book does start with a quote from Pocock. I'll just read one of them. He said, "It's a great art is rowing. It's the finest art there is. It's a symphony of emotion. And when you are rowing well, why, it's nearing perfection. And when you near perfection, you're touching the divine." Fourth, there was an extraordinary level of deep mutual trust and respect that these guys forged among themselves over the 3 years that they came together as a crew. You know, on one level, rowing is all about trust. From the moment you step into one of these 24-inch wide shells, everybody has to cooperate with everybody else and be doing the right thing at the right moment, just to keep the shell on an even keel, just to keep the shell upright. But when you're rowing, every blade has to go in the water at precisely the same moment. The force has to be applied equally. The blade has to come out of the water at precisely the moment. You can't see where you're going. You're rowing with your back to the finish line. You're literally hurling yourself into an unseen future with every stroke you take. You absolutely depend on everybody else in the boat. And you can only do that if you trust everybody else in the boat, very fundamentally. And if you have read the book, you know that trust, the theme of trust, also is right at the heart of Joe Rance's personal story. Joe, when he showed up at Washington in 1933, he was a good but very erratic oarsman. He didn't really trust anybody but himself at that point because of his life experience. And it was only when he talked to Pocock, only when Pocock began to get him to open himself up to the other guys more and to trust the other guys, that he became the really fine oarsman that he ultimately did. These guys built this bond of trust, and I have to tell you, they kept it for the rest of their lives. When they were old men, they still trusted and cared for one another on a very deep level. One of the really moving things for me when I was doing the research for this book was I was able to read the diaries and letters that a lot of them wrote in the days leading up to that gold medal race in Berlin that you just saw. It was so important to them. But what comes up over and over in those letters and diaries, the thing that was most important to them, they said this over and over as individuals. They revealed to their diaries they didn't want to let the other guys in the boat down. That was more important to them than anything else. Finally, the last quality I would point to as a sort of hallmark of these particular young men is this. And it may be the least obvious, but I think maybe in some ways the most important. And that is that each of them had a measure of humility. Now, make no mistake, these were big, strapping guys with healthy egos. It's a fairly audacious thing to go out for rowing. To think you're going to row for an Olympic gold medal is a very audacious thing. You have to have a pretty good sense of self, a pretty good sense of ego. But over the 3 years that they rowed together, out in the wind and the rain and the sleet with Ulrichsen barking at them, that taught each of them a measure of humility. And I think that understanding that there were things they could do better together than they could do individually, that element of humility was the gateway through which they were able to approach one another, open their hearts to one another, and build those bonds of trust that I was just talking about. And they retained, along with their trust for one another, they also retained that humility for the rest of their life. These were guys who, by and large, when they came home, many of them put their gold medals in sock drawers, closed the sock drawers, they went out, looked for a job, and never mentioned it in some cases to their friends and even their family. Some of their kids grew up not even knowing about this until later in life. A lot of them worked at Boeing. A lot of the people I've met since the book came out, a lot of people who worked side by side with them at Boeing who had no idea that they had won gold medals. There was a kind of fundamental humility that characterized all of them, with the possible exception of Bobby Mock. And I have to say, Bobby Mock played his role very well. Bob Mock, I have to tell you, this is just a digression, but Bob Mock did spend the rest of his life trying to promote what this crew had done, trying to get them into the Hall of Fame, trying to get news articles written about them. And there's another interesting thing about Bob that's kind of touching. His daughter Marilyn said that in many ways that moment in Berlin was the most intense moment of his life. And Marilyn felt that he spent the rest of his life trying to find something that was as intense and as meaningful to him as that moment. But that's a digression. So let me finish by saying that when I stand back from this story and contemplate what it means to me, the story of these 9 young men who climbed in a boat and learned to pull together so powerfully and so beautifully. To me, it seems, and I wasn't thinking this when I wrote the book, it came to me afterwards, but it seems to me the story of these 9 kids who learned to pull together so beautifully is an almost perfect metaphor for what that generation of Americans did. You know, they all found themselves in the same boat beginning in the fall of 1929. I'm talking about the generation that was my parents' generation, what Tom Brokaw called the greatest generation. The Depression humbled them. It taught them all a measure of humility. They found themselves in the same boat, and it was a difficult situation. They learned to pull together as a whole. As a generation, they did great things. They built great monuments like the Grand Coulee Dam. They won World War II on not one but 2 fronts. They built the most prosperous era in our history after the war. And so as I say, I think for me, sort of the big takeaway for me is that I think this story of these 9 of them is a pretty good metaphor for what all of them did. I'm a huge admirer of that generation. I want to finish by just reading a couple paragraphs from near the end of the book. Before I wrote the chapters about Berlin and the gold medal race, I wanted to go to Germany and see the race course for myself, so I did, of course. And I had an opportunity while I was there to go up on the balcony of that stone boathouse you may have seen in the film, where Hitler had stood, and look out over the scene and see it as he saw it. And this is just what was going through my heads that day that I was there and when I went up on that balcony. I visited the Wassersports Museum in Grunau, where late in the afternoon, Werner Philipp, the director, kindly led me up a set of stairs to the balcony of Haus West. I stood there for a long, quiet minute near where Hitler stood 75 years before, gazing out over the Langer Sea, seeing it much as he saw it. Down below me, young men were unloading a shell from a truck, singing something softly in German, preparing for an evening row. Out on the water, a single sculler, his blades glinting, worked his way down one of the lanes towards the large Ziel sign at the end of the course. Closer to me, swallows flew low over the water on silent wings, silhouetted against the declining sun, touching the water from time to time, dimpling the silver surface. Standing there, watching them, it occurred to me that when Hitler watched Joe and the boys fight their way back from the rear of the field to sweep ahead of Italy and Germany 75 years ago, he saw but did not recognize heralds of his doom. He could not have known that one day hundreds of thousands of boys just like them, boys who shared their essential natures, decent and unassuming, not privileged or favored by anything in particular, just loyal, committed, and perseverant, would return to Germany, dressed in olive drab, hunting him down. They are almost all gone now, the legions of young men who saved the world in the years just before I was born. But that afternoon, standing on the balcony of Haus West, I was swept with gratitude for their goodness and their grace, their humility and their honor, their simple civility, and all the things they taught us before they flitted across the evening water and finally vanished into the night. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you, everyone. Daniel Brown is willing to take questions, and I think we're going to move a microphone up front here, and if you'd be so good as to form a line, we'll take turns with questions and he'll address them. When you need to leave, we would love it if you would take 1 minute to take an iPod survey to give us feedback on the presentation today for Western Reads. Thank you.
Can you hear me without the podium mic? Okay, stay here then.
Yes, you can. Is it on? Okay, great.
That sounds good.
Excellent book, excellent observations on your part.
Thank you.
I've been at Western for 40 years. One little thing that probably you don't know, and maybe most of the audience doesn't know, Paul knows this, but with regard to the whole idea of crew at Western, Western has a great history of crew. And I'll give an example of how other people look at it. Several years ago, a military family lived on the top or up above Lake Samish. And when the husband and wife died, they left to Western their house, which was worth $500,000. And in their will, what they said was, every morning, we got up at 4 or 5 in the morning and had coffee, and we would sit every morning and watch those women crew, go out and work every frickin' morning, whether it was snowing or raining or blizzard. It just gave us such a great thrill and such hard work that was. And I just wanted to bring it up to our Western crowd if they didn't know.
Great. Thank you.
So I wanted to actually both thank you and ask you a question. I was involved in the sport of rowing for quite a long time. I was a coxswain for 14 years. And the thing that I felt most, from a very personal perspective, very compelling about this boat was that I've read many books about rowing, and nobody actually credits the role of the coxswain as you did. And so,
That's
with
not
the
an
exception of the frequent use of the word barking, to which I objected a small amount, it was really, obviously, Bobby Mock really had quite a spirit to him, and you captured that very well. So I'm curious how you gained that perspective on it, because it's very rare for people associated with rowing to understand that role.
I think I was inclined to be really interested in coxswains in general, because I'm only 5'7", which is how tall Bobby Mock was. And for me, it's just, before I really even knew much about it, I don't know, the idea of getting in a boat with a bunch of guys who are 6'5" or whatever and telling them what they're supposed to be doing, just, the way men interact, that's kind of intimidating. And so I was, from the very moment I understood the role, I was just intrigued. And then I met a lot of coxswains, I met a lot of rowers, because I'm not a rower. I went way out of my way to make sure I met a lot of rowers really early on and got a huge amount of input from them. But I also met a lot of coxswains along the way, and I listened really carefully to their experiences. In terms of Bobby Mock specifically, I was blessed in that his daughter Marilyn is, except for her gender, appears to be an almost perfect clone of Bobby Mock. She has, you're not here by any chance, are you, Marilyn? I'm going to say good stuff. She walks through life with her chin up. She's a very verbal person. She's very smart. She's a little pugnacious, She likes to take charge of things. And she was a very good sort of stand-in for her dad, I think. And so mostly it was talking to her and looking at his documents and listening to what the other guys said about Bob. Bob was such an influence on that crew that everybody had things to say about him. There was a lot in the sports writing about Bob Mock, too, because he was seen early on to be a very good coxswain, and so a lot was written about him. Anybody else? Yes?
For me as an Easterner who've been out here 25 years, but from New York, reading it was also a chance to understand more about the Pacific Northwest. But on the other hand, this is my parents' generation, and my father, you know, the boy from the Bronx who went to the University of Wisconsin, was in a way the counterpart
Sure.
of these guys. But you said something tonight. You said they opened up to each other,
Yeah.
and you were talking about the trust, and that startled me because the men of this generation so much didn't open up to each other.
know.
And I wonder if you could talk about whether, you said they stayed open to each other and trusting, whether that translated into being more like the way women, we open up to each other in terms of talking to each other so much more. And could you talk about that?
Yeah, well, that's certainly true of that generation. My experience of that generation of men is that they tended not to be very open with one another. And I have to tell you, most of these guys were gone by the time I got involved in this. So a great deal of the reunions that they had very frequent reunions, but more than that, their families got together all the time for backyard barbecues and things like that. A great deal of those anecdotes about how close they were came from their children, their daughters and sons and grandchildren. But I could also see it, I have to tell you, in the last two who were alive, Joe and Roger Morris. You know, there were a number of really moving things about those two, but one is that they would get on the telephone. I saw this with my own eyes. Joe, and there were only two of them left, Joe and Roger. They would get on the phone. Roger lived down in Maple Valley, a couple hours south of where Joe lived in Redmond. They'd get on the phone once a week or so. And they'd get on the phone and they would say in the course of 20 minutes, they'd say maybe 10 words. I mean, it was just these long, really long pauses. They'd say, something, and then be a long silence. The other would say something, there'd be a long silence. The point is they just needed to be together. They after all those years, they still, even if it was just on the phone, even if they didn't really actually have anything to say, they just kept wanting to reach out and make contact with each other. So that was really moving to behold. I should also say, just sort of in a general area, it's very conspicuous. As I say, I get emails all the time about people finishing the book and having tears in their eyes. And I haven't done like a statistical study of it, but I'm quite sure that the biggest single slice of those people is not women, it's men, and it's particularly men of that generation. It's older men, it's men in their 80s and 90s now, who it really brings to tears. And I just think that's interesting.
It's a bit of a divergent question, but the story's a lot about class, and many folks here, as well as from then to now, were first-generation college students, and this team sort of won out over some multi-generation, and they're, up against the Ivy Leagues. What did you learn about class and class mobility from being in this story?
Yeah, I just learned it was a huge deal in the 30s. I mean, a couple different things. There was a class thing going on. There was also a regional thing going on. I mean, there was a real East versus West thing. There was a real feeling in the West that Eastern press and Eastern institutions and Eastern people in general didn't respect, didn't even know Western athletes existed. So there was that going on. But absolutely, these guys were working class. They were all, I'm sure, almost all first generation college. And that quite early when I was doing the research, I realized that had to be part of the story, because the assumptions that went along with that were so prevalent, and it was so much of what they faced when they had to go back east to row, that they were rowing against multi-generational, relatively wealthy, multi-generational college students. It just was a big sort of bear in the room kind of, elephant in the room kind of thing that had to be talked about. It was part of what shaped their world.
Hi, I have a question, but I'd like to put it in context first. So just briefly, this is the only book where I've woken up at 3:30 and 4 in the morning because I just had to keep reading it, and I read a lot. So what I'm wondering is, you knew you had a good story going into it, but when did you realize you have something really exceptional? Was it while you were writing it, or when did you, and there must be different levels that you hit it at.
Yeah, I mean, there are different levels. I had a pretty good idea it was something exceptional literally the day I met Joe. I mean, I'm not being a hyperbolic here. I fell into that story and I was just blown away. That said, there are a lot of uncertainties. All I knew at that point was Joe was a really cool, interesting guy. It could have turned out to be Joe and 8 jerks in a boat, for all I know. I didn't know who these other guys were at all, you know? And as I was, mercifully, as I worked my way through them and I met the families of each of them and I found out their backstories, they all genuinely turned out to be interesting guys, nice guys, guys with great backstories. So that was a big relief. And then you never know. I mean, by the time I was finished with 7 sample chapters, we put the book out. My agent put the book out to the publishers in New York, and it very quickly turned into an auction situation. There was so much interest. It's kind of cool. My wife and I were on vacation in Tucson, and I didn't know Dorian was putting the book out. So I woke up Saturday morning, and we were going to go play tennis, because that's what my wife likes to do, so she drags me out on the tennis court. So we got up, and we're getting ready to play tennis, and Dorian called, and she said, "Don't leave the room." I put the book out, and we're getting all kinds of interest. So I sat there, and she started putting calls through to me. And the first publisher that called, I thought, well, I got to pitch this book to this, big publisher. About 30 seconds into that conversation, I realized he was pitching himself to me. And my whole world shifted. Because up till then, I was all about, can I get a publisher to publish a book, please? And I suddenly realized they were bidding against each other for the right to publish this book based on 7 chapters. So that was a pretty good sign. And then even after that, though, there's another hurdle. You finish the book, you work, you have a contract, you make your deadline, you finish it, it goes off to editing. There's months and months go by, and then it hasn't yet actually gone out into the world. You've had maybe 24 people, well, more, because I had a lot of rowers read it. A few dozen people read it. But you don't really know if all those publishers are right, if you're right, your agent's right, your editor, they all think it's great, but you don't know until the book gets out there. And so publishing any book is a leap of faith, because sometimes really good books fail for all kinds of reasons. Sometimes really bad books do really well for all kinds of reasons that we won't go into. So there's a huge leap of faith in publishing any book, but it was an incremental thing, but it really did start with that day I met Joe.
All right. What was the most important lesson you took away from the process of writing this book?
Well, I learned a lot about writing. I mean, it's the 3rd book I've written, but in many ways, I think I learned more about writing from this one. So just on the level of writing, I learned a lot about technique. I learned how to construct scenes and things like that. And to me, that's really important. In terms of life lessons, it's just that humility thing I got to go back to. When I met Joe, the first time I met Joe, I immediately flashed to my father. My father was born the same year as Joe. My father's father died in the fall of 1929, the same month that Joe's family abandoned him. My father's mother had to raise 3 kids with no real means of raising a kid. My dad was very much a child of the Depression. But he was also a very civil, very gentle, and very humble man. And when I met Joe, boom, it was like my dad, who had previously died, was sitting in front of me. And then I started meeting these other guys or meeting the families and discovering who they were, and there was this common thread of humility to them that really impressed me. And it, actually, I should mention this because it leads into something that a rowing coach said that I think is just absolutely fascinating about rowers. He said that a good rower has to simultaneously have a big ego and a little ego. He has to have a big enough ego to do this thing. He has to have a little enough ego to let go of himself or herself and become part of the bigger thing that is the boat. And I've been around the country the last year and a half. I've met hundreds and hundreds of rowers of all ages, from teenagers to 90s. They seem to have that common characteristic. They're forward-leaning people. They're people of great character. They tend to be kind of outgoing people. But they all have a kind of little element of humility to them, that little ego that you can see they could fit themselves in to a group or into a cause that, for me, is sort of the defining characteristic of so many of the oars men and oars women that I've met. Hi.
I'm curious, whatever, I wasn't here at the start, so you might have already talked about it. What exactly is going on with the movie rights? Judy and Ray told me that Weinstein had thrown out Kenneth Branagh.
Yeah.
What's the latest there?
So the latest is we optioned the film rights to the Weinstein Company. Kenneth Branagh took a great interest in it, and he convinced Harvey Weinstein. And so we optioned it to the Weinstein Company, and Weinstein Company about a year ago exercised the option and bought the film rights outright. In the meantime, Branagh and Weinstein came to a parting of the ways, about which I don't know anything, except that Branagh is no longer on the project. So at this point, what I know about the film project is they have acquired the rights. They are working on a script. They periodically make noise like they're going to actually introduce me to the screenwriters, but it hasn't actually happened. And that's about all I know. You know, they're not being enormously transparent, but that may be because they haven't actually got much traction going on it yet. They seem to be moving forward. They just seem to be moving forward in fits and starts. I think this is the second screenwriter they've had on it. I think they may be having trouble getting a script they really like. But I have very little, I have essentially no say in terms of the script or anything else about the film. I was telling somebody at lunch that the contract obliges them to put my name on a flash screen up front, a title screen up front, and it obliges them to list me as a consultant at the end, but it doesn't oblige them to actually consult me. And it obliges them to give me 2 tickets to the premiere, which is a huge problem if this ever happens, because I have a wife and 2 daughters, and Judy has a family, and it's like, whoa, I'm just going to leave town. My wife's already picked out an outfit. My daughters are working on it. It's like, I don't know. I don't know what I'm going to do. Anyway, that's where the film is. Yes.
In the races leading up to the final 8-man shell, were there any American boats in those races?
No, well, yes, there were. There were American 4s and doubles. There were quite a few American crews there other than the 8s. They were terribly handicapped. They had a terrible time getting equipment. The 8 had this beautiful Pocock shell that really was state-of-the-art. The other American teams were rowing really clunky, heavy, old boats, and they were very handicapped. And I don't remember what the best finish. Does anybody know? I think there was a bronze in there somewhere, but that was it. It was a huge disappointment to the rowing community, the performance other than the performance in the 8.
Joe Rance, he just was really got to my heart. I think that his story of growing up was just so
pitiful, really. It was a very sad story. And I'm just wondering if you got a sense that Joe was ever able to really overcome that difficult upbringing and the adversity in his young life.
Yeah, I can speak quite authoritatively about that, actually, because I asked it myself, and then after Joe was gone, Judy and I talked about it a lot. Joe was a remarkable guy in a number of ways, but one of the ways in which he was remarkable was he was totally forward-looking. He did not believe in wasting time or energy on things that had happened in the past hurts. He talked specifically about this. He didn't want to waste energy thinking and talking about Thula and his father and all that stuff that had happened. Even in his last few weeks of life, he was interested in what was going to happen today or the next day. He was just remarkably positive, optimistic in his view of the world. And he didn't harbor a lot of bitterness, as far as I can tell. Joyce is a different story entirely. Joyce was very bitter about what had happened to Joe and made herself clear about that. But Joe was not interested in that. I also should say that Joe, once Thula died, Joe reconciled with his father quite quickly. Joe just wanted to be back with his dad. That's all he wanted as far as family went. He just wanted to get back with his dad. So when Thula passed away, they reconciled quite quickly. In terms of Thula, I also always feel when I talk about her as if I should go out of my way to say, in many ways, Thula comes across as the stereotypical evil stepmom, and everything that's in there is well documented. It all happened. But I think it's kind of important also to acknowledge that Thula died in 1934, whatever it was. Thula hasn't been around to give her side of the story, so I just think that's kind of important. There may have been things going on that we don't know about. But I did take a lot of care to talk to Thula's other living son, Harry Jr., and he backed up everything Joe said. In fact, he went beyond what Joe said about what had happened between himself and Thula. So.
I'm really interested in, you've referenced several times about the number of emails you get, and you've written this very popular book that people have very powerful reactions to. So you're getting all this email, and I'm kind of envisioning you sitting at your computer for hours and hours responding to all these things. So I would just be interested in how, as an author, you respond to that kind of accolades.
In terms of email, until about 6 months ago, I was answering every email I got. On my website, there's a little contact form, and all that does is just send an email straight to me. So I was staying up deep into the hours, late night hours, last spring, answering every email as thoughtfully as I could, sometimes write long emails. And in the last 6 months, it's just gotten impossible. I just literally can't answer them. There's too many. So if people have a problem or something I can do something about, I answer them at this point. But for the most part, I just can't answer them. It's just too many. And other than that, it's just been kind of a mind-bending experience. Yeah, I mean, it's as to say, I thought the book would do well from a very early stage, but it's really exceeded my expectations. So it's fun.
I really enjoyed how you developed George Pocock's character, his reverence for wood and his spiritual type of approach to the art of rowing. Where did you get the inspiration for that character?
So George Pocock was, there's certain moments when you write a book like this when it's just kind of aha moments. And I was, 6 months or so into writing the book before I bothered to figure out who this Pocock character was. And when I figured it out, it was like, badam, because he's so interesting. And I was able to develop him very completely, I think, largely because his son Stan, who was very much like his dad, took an interest, sat with me for many, many hours of interviews, and gave me access to his dad's personal papers. So, and Stan is also a pretty good stand-in for his father. He's very much a gentleman, very gentle, and I don't know if any of you know Stan Pocock, but he was a rowing coach for many years. And so between the stuff that has been written about Pocock, and there is a fair amount of stuff that Pocock has been written about him, the stuff Pocock himself wrote, and you can get a good sense of the man from the kinds of things he said, and then working with Stan and George's papers, it was able to come together, and it was really a privilege to be able to write about him. He was an extraordinary man.
I was struck by the character of the boat itself, and I'm guessing that today it's carbon fiber, and so I'm curious of your perspective on that generation of men and how they related to wood, and if that tradition is continuing. Are there people building still with wood?
There is a guy actually in Port Townsend named Steve Chapin who actually Stan Pocock handed off some of George's original equipment, tools, and also handed him some of this old growth cedar from cut in the 1920s or whatever. And Steve Chapin out in Port Townsend is building Pocock replicas, basically, with George's tools, with his wood, and building them exactly the way that George built them. Now they cost like $50,000 a piece or something, and there are not very many of them. So there is that, he is doing that. You know, the other thing about that is that it was kind of a mercy. George Pocock died in 1979, I think, 76. Okay, right about when wood was really becoming untenable as a building material, and fiberglass and then carbon fiber were, you know, the obvious thing. You can't build a boat out of wood and expect to win a race in it. They're just too much heavier than the new materials. So George never, you know, went through that transition to more modern materials, but shortly after his dad died, Stan took the company in that direction. He had to be competitive.
I just want to say that we have a Pocock single hanging in our Viking Union. If you go out the doors and go right in through the doors outside, you can see one hanging. It's beautiful. So if you have a moment, check it out before you leave today.
First of all, I want to say that it's a great book. And second, I can relate to Joe's life, you know, because growing up I had a difficult life. And anyway, so reading this book, there are a lot of skills that, you know, we can use in our life to be successful. So what should young people like our generation take from this book to be successful in their lives?
I think a couple things just come to mind off the top. There's so many, you know, qualities, as I said, that characterize these guys. I think perseverance, you know, I wish I had been more perseverant as a young man. there are a lot of things I could have pushed myself through that I didn't because I just didn't. I was lazy, or I was not motivated enough, or whatever. That really would have been rewarding if I had. So I think being perseverant, I think being tenacious, I think being resilient when life knocks you down, that's another quality that characterized these guys. They were very resilient, and they went through all kinds of trials and tribulations I can only imagine. So bouncing back, those things are, you know, easy to say and hard to do, but I think they're the core of what sort of made these guys. That and this humility, this business of, you know, what humility bought them is it taught them to listen to each other. It taught them to look at Cal, their opponents, and see what Cal was doing better than they were doing. It taught them to listen to what Ulbrichtson was screaming at them about. It taught them to learn from one another when that might not have seemed like an obvious thing to do. So I really do think having that element of humility coupled with a healthy ego is really, really central to being a young person and becoming an older person that you're happy with.
We're out of time now, so Mr. Brown is willing to sign books and would be happy to do that for you. Is the signing table in the back, Anna? The signing table's in the back room. Thank you so much for
Thank you.
coming.